was, you know, there were ESCOs, energy services companies, getting districts in a corner, having them sign contracts. The districts really didn't understand completely. They thought they were going to get a certain result, and they were left wondering if they really even got the energy savings that were guaranteed. And, you know, it's really just like any project. If you did a bond, for example, and you didn't know what the pricing of the bidders was, and you didn't have an architect and a construction manager watching over things, you would be lost. You would be wondering who's making what, who's doing what am I really getting here? And that's the way energy performance contracts used to be run, essentially. There was no one really in the middle there to advise districts about how to make it transparent, how to make sure they were getting a good deal. But the good news is now there are companies, you know, like our firm and others that specialize in helping you get the best out of these projects. And so could it still be smoke and mirrors? Sure, just like anything. The key is availing yourself to the most current, accurate information about what's being done today to make sure that they go well, and making sure you have that right team in place, just like you always do for your bonds. Make sure you start an EPC off strong with a good team that can really protect you and make sure that there are no smoke and mirrors. So again, thanks for your attendance today. Dave, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slides. Really quickly, I know there are several attendees on today that weren't in attendance for our EPC 101 webinar 2 weeks ago. Just to acquaint you with who we are and why we're up here speaking about this subject matter. We're not an energy services company like Johnson Controls, and they're called ESCOs, the companies that normally run these projects and build these projects out. What we are specialists in the intricacies of how an energy performance contract does get put together. We perform comprehensive owner's rep services, defending your interests every single step of the way in the process. We're also licensed engineers and architects, so typically for a project that we would engage with a school district on for an energy performance contract, we replace the architect of record for that particular project because it is so different, as we're going to go over, and it is necessary to get a specialized expertise on your team. So that's who we are. I won't go through all of these bullets in the interest of time, but we have been doing this for a long time. And if we could go to the next slide. For anyone who is not entirely familiar with the concept, again, I know there are quite a few people on today that weren't part of the EPC 101 webinar. I'll just quickly go over the concept. Essentially, an energy performance contract, or EPC, is a partnership. It's a partnership between your school district and what's called an ESCO, Energy Services Company. These are large companies, typically like Johnson Controls, Siemens, Honeywell, ESG, others. And it's a unique process. Even though they're building out a construction project, they're a professional services company. So what's going to happen is when you engage in an EPC, these companies will respond to a request for proposals that your district issues. All right, they're responding to an RFP, not a bid, an RFP. They will then go through and do detailed audits of all your facilities, looking for any and all energy savings opportunities. They'll be looking at everything that consumes energy, looking at what's currently installed, comparing what's currently installed to the latest, most efficient technology that's available today for that particular system. And they're going to be running an ROI essentially on all of those different systems to determine what makes sense to replace and what doesn't. And they're also going to be asking you, what are the items, for example, from your building addition survey that are energy related that you really need to fund? Like an old boiler that keeps falling out of the bond, or windows, roofs. These are all eligible for inclusion in an energy performance contract. But essentially, these companies are going to go through, they're going to develop proposals with their own site-specific scopes of work that they feel comfortable proposing, that will make your district more efficient, that pays for itself in 18 years or less. You will then select one of those companies. They will go on to build the project in a turnkey manner, and then guarantee that if you move forward, you will receive a specific amount of guaranteed energy savings on an annual basis that will, at minimum, cover the cost of the debt service on the project. If there's extra savings, those are yours to keep, but they must generate enough savings to cover the cost of the debt service on the project. If those savings do not materialize, they have to cut you a check for the difference. They have to make you whole. So what's most important for business officials to just recognize about EPCs is that it's a completely different funding source than a traditional project. In an EPC, the funding source is the guaranteed energy savings that the project will yield over time. That's what pays for the project. Next slide, please. Okay, won't spend too much on this again, because we did go over this in the last webinar, but there are many, many benefits really as my message with this slide, particularly right now as we are coming out of COVID-19, and you know, every district I talk to is either postponing their bond, rethinking their bond. You know, the idea of going to your taxpayers for more right now is just a non-starter. And what's great about EPCs is that they don't require voter approval, and they use a portion of what you're already spending in your utility lines as the funding source. So there's no increase in taxes, it's budget neutral, it's tailor-made for the times that we are currently in and will be in for the foreseeable future, because it doesn't, it's not, or rather it's exempt from a lot of the more onerous requirements of a traditional bond that require your taxpayers to ante up more money. You don't have to do this in an EPC, okay? That's not supposed to happen at all. And so that's what I want to leave you with on this slide. It's really something that business officials need to know about right now and moving into the next few years. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into the myths. That's why you're here. So myth number one is that EPCs are more expensive than traditional capital projects. A lot of people think that when you do an EPC, you're paying a premium. But if you take into account all the different unique aspects of EPCs that work not only to reduce tangible costs, but they work very actively to reduce and limit the cost of your precious time, energy, and aggravation throughout the project, I think you'll view them differently. If we could just advance to the next slide, I'll explain that. There are really many unique aspects to EPCs that have real value for school business officials as the ones who are always in the middle of a capital project of any sort. And you know, you're the ones who have to control all the parties and the costs and everything. And I don't need to tell you, you know, how much effort goes into controlling a project, but you're significantly less burden for you in an EPC. And your time is money. Everybody's time is money, and it's worth something very significant. And you'll have to spend a lot less time doing a lot of the regular chores of running a capital project in an EPC. The first is that Wick's law does not apply. So that equals significantly less administrative burden for you. Wick's law requires that all New York State government agencies directly hire 4 separate contractors for general construction, plumbing, electrical work, and heating and ventilation. So that's 4 times the number of contracts that you, as the business official, need to be in the middle of bidding, administrating, managing. In an EPC, you have 1 ESCO that delivers the entire project, 1 contract. So again, how much is your time worth? It's worth a lot. How much other work could you be doing if you didn't have to be administrating all of those various contracts? In an EPC, you don't have to do that. It's very streamlined. You've got one contract to manage. The second thing is that there are no change orders allowed in an EPC unless it's something that you initiate, that you would like to change. But the ESCO cannot come back to you like they can in a regular, people can in a regular project and be like, oh, well, this one didn't do their diligence and we found this, so we need a change order and it's going to cost X. There's none of that nonsense. It's a fixed price contract. So think about your last big capital project. How many change orders did you have? How much of your own time did you have to spend reviewing them, justifying them or not, going to the board, explaining them? Was it possibly an embarrassing situation having to go to the board and explain this? No board wants to see anything like that. Who does? Neither do you. How much did the change orders tally up to at the end of the day when your project was over? And what is it worth to you as the business official to not have to deal with any of that whatsoever? That's what you get in an EPC. There's a lot of security in that for you, in that you will not have to worry about cost overruns. Once you set the price, it's done, you move on, and you forget about it. The third thing that's different in an EPC, and this is related to the change orders point, is that the costs are fixed and the ESCOs have to hold their costs for often a year plus, even if materials and labor costs go up. So for example, back when SED was a 12-month backlog, right? I remember the price of steel went up, and no matter what goes up, the ESCOs have to hold their costs. They can't come back to you and say, oh, well, all these things went up, so now I want, more money. That doesn't enter into the equation here. The same thing recently happened when the solar tariffs, the unanticipated solar trade war tariffs went into effect. The ESCOs, they didn't like it. They don't like it, but they had to absorb the extra costs. They could not go back and change the contract. So if you were trying to do, say, a solar project, and then that happened while your project was up in SCD in a traditional method, you would have budgeted a certain amount. Costs would have went up while it's sitting in SCD. It comes out of SCD. Now you bid it and say the price is double or whatever it is. Now what do? You either have to reduce the project scope or find money. It's a very uncomfortable situation. You don't have that in an EPC. Again, more security, very low risk for you as the business official when it comes to budgeting and knowing what your long-term costs for the entire initiative are going to be. And, if prices go up for, say, solar, and the ESCO's absorbing that, that's actually a savings for you, if you think about it. That's a savings for the district. All those districts we worked with that had that situation, the ESCOs complained, but they knew they had to eat it anyway. So that's something also to consider. The fourth aspect, and a lot of people think that the ESCO makes a premium for everything that I just mentioned. Oh, okay, well, they're making a lot more money, but in a controlled project, they don't have to be. So what I'm saying is, if you have an ESCO and no one is really watching them, and nobody on your team knows what unit costs actually should be, which are reasonable, which are unreasonable. If you don't have a consultant or somebody holding their feet to the fire and making them make their numbers transparent, making them declare unit costs, making them declare their overhead and profit, you think you're going to get that information willingly from there? No way. That's one of the things that people don't like about EPCs is that the ESCOs don't want you to know what their costs are unless you force them to declare it. So my point here is that you can have the best of both worlds. You can have all these nice things that I just mentioned about EPCs, and you can have the peace of mind of knowing that the costs are reasonable and you're not paying a premium, and that you would be paying a similar cost for the equipment in a traditional capital project. But the key is you have to have the right people who can control not only the process, but the ESCO as well. And then finally, the ESCO is on the hook for the savings, right? So they have to guarantee the savings. In order to guarantee the savings, they have a vested interest in ensuring that whatever complex equipment they install performs. If it doesn't perform after they leave, they know they're cutting you a check. So they don't want to do that because it makes them look bad, gives them a bad reputation, and they win their work through RFP. So they're going to work very hard against that. And so what you find is that they are all over the performance of these systems. And even after they leave the job site and everything's installed, they're monitoring it. They're making sure your staff has training. There's a guaranteed performance that goes hand in hand with the savings guarantee. They're not all over making sure that equipment works. They're cutting a check. They don't want to do that. Many years ago, we were engaged with a large school district that had just built a new high school. And as what happens many times in traditional projects is that the controls, whether they're installed right or wrong or commissioned or not in a traditional capital project, they always end up getting screwed up over time. Everybody leaves, they get overridden, or people don't know how to use them. And actually a lot of the projects that we do, the EPC projects we do, the main focus is fix these controls. They never worked right, and they don't work right. So they had a new high school that was running like a hospital. The AC was fighting the heat. It was extremely expensive. Now this new state-of-the-art system was supposed to save them money. And it not only was costing them a lot more in energy, but they were about to spend about $80,000 to have retro commissioning done to fix the problems. And everybody had left the job, everybody got paid, and they were left with these problems. So the point there is really, it could cost you more if you do these kinds of projects through the traditional means, because there really is no incentive for anyone to make sure that it works, not only when they leave, but just long term, and commission it and make sure that it's not going to fail. And that if there is an issue, the ESCOs are running in to fix it. So there's a reliability to the savings and the reduction in your energy costs, your long-term costs, when you go the EPC route. So a lot of info on this slide, but you don't get these assurances when you do a capital project. So I would argue that if you were to tally up the hours and your hourly costs and your department's costs for having to get into the middle of all the various scenarios that I just described on a regular capital project, I would argue you're not saving anything on a regular capital project, because there's a real value to everybody's time. The more you have to get involved with issues and disputes, the less time you have to work on other important things, or there's an opportunity cost there. So I really do not like when people say that EPCs are more expensive, because often the whole picture is not being evaluated. So I did want to share all of those unique aspects with you. Next slide, please. Okay, the next myth is traditional project teams can defend your interests during an EPC. So this is not, and I want to start with this, to disparage architects or CMs in any way whatsoever. I'm friends with them. I respect what they do. They do great work. But to use an analogy, if you're accused of murder, let's just say, who are you hiring to go into court and defend you? Are you hiring your corporate lawyer who maybe you like, they've done a lot of work for you, you really feel like you trust them, or are you going to get a seasoned criminal defense attorney to defend you in this particular legal matter? What happens a lot with projects that don't quite go the way they're supposed to is that there's a mismatching of the core competencies of the team that's running the EPC. One of the biggest misunderstandings about EPCs is that just because there's a state education department submittal component to it, that the architect should automatically run the whole project. And I see that happening, but when you have that scenario, again, that's kind of when you run into some difficulties that you shouldn't need to run into, had you had the right eyes on everything. So unfortunately, that myth has not been dispelled by the firms involved voluntarily. So I just want to explain why this is so important. It has nothing to do with ECG or wanting to cast any blame on anyone, but there are real realities about how these projects are constructed. And you have to take a hard look at who is the team that's defending you and representing you. Next slide. Okay, I think the most important takeaway, if nothing else from this webinar today, is to appreciate the importance of the following statement, which I'm going to tell you right now. This is the entire financial foundation of the EPC. The entire financial foundation of an EPC is the quality and the accuracy of energy savings calculations that the ESCO develops to determine the annual energy savings and consequently the size of the project. That is the entire financial foundation. If those are not good, if those are inflated or overestimated, you're going to have a shaky foundation at best. You're not going to have a good foundation. Who's checking the calculations? Your architect? Who's actually skilled enough to say to Johnson Controls that this calculation and this guarantee methodology for weatherization or motors or steam traps is not appropriate? You're overestimating the savings, and here is why. Who on your team is going to be able to do that? Believe me, the ESCOs know when a team can and can't do that to them on the district side. And they're also great companies, but don't think that they can't spot a lack or an imbalance of expertise on your side and then exploit that. It's just the way it goes. That's the game in these projects. So you need to fully appreciate that this is not just another SED submittal. We're talking about the financial foundation. I know I keep saying it, but it's the whole foundation of your project. If that's crap, the rest of the project is going to be built on something that cannot materialize. It cannot support it. So you're not going to be getting the savings you thought you were going to be getting. You're not going to be getting meaningful measurement and verification reports that you think you're going to be getting. So nothing is more important than really appreciating that. So you need to ask yourself, who on my team, who on the district team, do I have 1,000% confidence is going to be able to go up to multiple ESCOs and tell them they're wrong and why? Who has that skill set? And I mean really has the skill set. You have to really ask that question. Next, please. So even aside from all of that, I just want to say that, and I want to really explain, because EPCs are different in another way from regular capital projects, in that the systems we're replacing in EPCs, 90% mechanical engineering. Okay, we're talking about boilers, unit ventilators, HVAC, stuff that is going to be designed by engineers one way or the other, whether you hire your architect. If they don't have that in-house, they're going to have to go out and then hire engineers to design 90% of your project. Is that value for your district? Having that layer in between you and the engineers that are really going to have to design this, you have to think about that. And really, when we do a project, the lion's share of the work we do is not the SED submittal piece. Yes, that's very important, and you need to know what SED will and won't allow when it comes specifically to EPCs and the aidability of EPCs, because they're going to be reviewing the investment grade audit. And if you don't have the right eyes on that going into SED, they could decimate your project. So it's an important part, but most of what we spend our time doing is assigning certified energy managers and certified energy auditors to the district from day one, reviewing your data, creating an appropriate baseline, setting up technical parameters in the RFP that we create, reviewing the ESCO's proposals, scrutinizing all their calculations and their costs and all of the numbers, scrutinizing their contract language, making sure that the district is going to have a solid contract. They all start out favoring the ESCO. So there's a lot of work that goes into the contract. So again, the point is there's a very different skill set that's required to appropriately defend your interests during an EPC. And I just, please think about this for the fate of your project, for your own sake, because they're great projects. You just have to be able to control them properly. And in order to do that, you've got to enlist some help because it is such a niche. Next slide, please. Okay. The next myth that we'll go over is that EPCs lock you into proprietary equipment. I was just in Dutchess County a few months ago presenting to some facilities directors, and one of them was like, well, that's great, but you know, I don't want to be locked into Siemens control systems, so I don't want to do an EPC. And it was upsetting because that is a holdover myth from the EPCs of 20 years ago. That's kind of what happened, again, because nobody knew what to look at, how to look at it, and ESCOs just kind of did what they wanted. And even today, there are still ESCOs that wouldn't mind locking you into something like that. They wouldn't mind. They would try. But it's no reason not to do an EPC. If we go to the next slide. EPCs that are properly managed are not only going to explicitly disallow the inclusions of proprietary systems right in the RFP, but ESCOs might still even try, even if you disallow it in the RFP, they might still try to get that kind of equipment in there. And it's not that easy to see if you're not really a trained engineer looking at the systems and knowing how the back end operates. And you just kind of have to have a background. You have to know what's proprietary, what's a proprietary design, what isn't. So unfortunately, this is a myth that won't die, but the bottom line is, again, it comes to control. EPCs do not have to lock you into anything. They don't have to. If nobody's watching, they might. You know, it might happen that way. But that's certainly not the rule. It's certainly not something that ESCOs are going to walk away from if you disallow it. They all know that they've got to allow you to be able to hire different contractors to come in and service that equipment, that nobody wants to be locked in to a certain ESCO for the rest of their lives to come in at whatever rate they decide they want to charge and service that equipment. Nobody likes that and nobody wants that. Most of the ESCOs, they know that. Even if they try to do it, people will find out and they'll be upset with them. So again, you just have to know that you just disallow it. and you make sure that it doesn't end up in the final contract. Next. Okay. So myth number 4, and I'm going a little quickly because, you know, we had a late start, but myth number 4 is that EPCs aren't eligible for as much aid as traditional capital work. Again, I was just talking to a business official a couple months ago at another presentation, and they were saying, you know, I was told that I don't get as much aid on an EPC, so I'm not even considering doing one. And that also is upsetting. I don't know who's saying these things, but that is absolutely not true. And if we go to the next slide, here's the bottom line. We lost the slides, but I'll keep going. Here's the bottom line when it comes to aid on an EPC project. Let's just say you get 60% building aid on a traditional bond. And that's your building aid ratio. You don't have to vote or approve EPC projects. And so if you don't vote or approve it, 10% is deducted from your normal building aid. So if you do an EPC, you don't get it voter approved, instead of getting your normal 60, you would get 50%. What people are not fully always realizing or telling you is that if you want to go get your EPC voter approved, you can. And if you do, you will get your full building aid amount. The only difference with an EPC is that you have a choice in the matter. If you don't want to go through all the hoops of, you know, getting voter approval and the cost and the time of that, and sometimes with certain communities, the uncertainty of that outcome, you don't have to do it. If you want to, great. So the bottom line is EPCs they do get as much aid as traditional capital projects if you vote them, but you don't have to. Did we lose the slides? Because all of a sudden I'm not seeing them, but I'm gonna keep going. On to myth 5, which is an EPC's 18-year term needs to be complete prior to engaging in another EPC. Okay. Dave will be back on with the slides in a minute. Okay. Sorry about that. Oh, and I should say the code for you guys is Ashley. Ashley is the code. Okay. Almost forgot that. So we have had conversations, and there's a lot of confusion, and it's kind of a sticky point. We're going to kind of just go over it high level, and I'll ask Dave to comment on this because he gets involved with some of these stickier kind of situations more so than I do. But go to the myth 5 debunked slide. We are doing a lot of phase 2, phase 3 EPC projects right now. For clients that we did their original EPC only, say, 8 years ago, and what's driving a lot of the current additional EPCs is the tremendous, tremendous savings that comes with doing an LED lighting comprehensive retrofit. We are seeing districts save 50% off of what they were paying from the new lighting that was installed 8 years ago by moving to LED. That generates a tremendous amount of savings. And Dave, would you like to kind of just comment on what you see here with when a district says, oh, well, I did an EPC 8 years ago and the 18-year term isn't up yet, so I don't think I can do an EPC right now. It's not really always true.
Sure, Kendra. So one of the things you have to realize is that SED and even the banks that fund EPCs understand the effective useful life of equipment and do not object to the replacement of things like lighting or retrofitting fixtures that were done in the previous project. SED has very specific rules that as long as you follow them for a retrofit type arrangement, they will not only allow you to do it as a capital upgrade, 5 or 7 years after the original project, they'll also even provide aid on that upgrade because they do understand the obsolescence rate of things like lighting. The other thing is that we're very careful that when we do work in the phase two, we don't overlap existing items that were providing savings. We go on top of those savings. We find new measures, new technologies, items that weren't able to be picked up in the original phase one because of the financial constraints, the 18-year simple payback rules of SED. In the second round, because we pick up such an extraordinary amount of savings with the new LED technology, lighting technology, things like solar that is now justifiable but wasn't 7 or 8 years ago, drives a savings and aidability that now allows us to pick up many of the items that in the first project we just simply couldn't do. So it really does create a great opportunity to pick up things you couldn't do in the first round. A lot of elimination of pneumatics on EMS systems where it's a very expensive endeavor. So the first, usually phase one projects often can't get all of it, but we can pick it up in the second phase. And as we said, the lighting, SED has very explicit rules that allow that lighting to be upgraded and aidable under the project. The savings under lighting is also so good with the LED. The technology has marched forward so well, even in cases where the lighting isn't providing the supplemental state aid, the simple payback justifies the work as well. So you usually end up in a mix of aidable and non-aidable lighting and EMS, but it still makes for a very beneficial project. Okay.
Thank you, Dave.
No problem.
Yeah, so bottom line, don't write it off if you just did an EPC. It's not always possible. It comes down to a basic ROI. You know, we're going to tell you, does the extra savings that you could reap from the newer technology justify moving forward or not? You know, and all of that needs to be done up front. So again, just keep an open mind with it. If you have done an EPC in recent years, but you haven't done LED, really take a look at it. I mean, we are funding projects that are 2 times bigger than the original EPCs now in these second projects using the LED lighting savings. But if you go off and do the LED lighting on your own, you can't claim it in the EPC. So you got to be careful about that. If you want to fund other work through the LED lighting, you have to save that lighting for the EPC project. Okay. All right, we got through it in about 45 minutes. So, you know, if I glossed over anything, we do have on our website, or you can email me. I'll show you my email in a minute, but we can provide you a link to the recording of the EPC 101 webinar that we gave last time. And that really kind of gets into more of the concept and is like lays the groundwork for everything we're discussing today. So just to summarize, really, when you're receiving guidance on an EPC, it's very important to consider the source. Who's telling you a certain thing? Because unfortunately, I think a lot of this misinformation gets perpetuated by those who may or may not want you to be doing an EPC. Okay, not everybody benefits from you doing an EPC. It's not in everybody's interest to have you go off and do an EPC. So you have to be very, very careful about who's saying it and why. Are they saying these projects don't work because they have a recent experience of a couple of them that went nowhere? Have they earned the right? Have they earned the right to be informing you about this particular concept and the intricacies and what makes them an expert in order to relay this information? I'm telling you, I wouldn't be doing this webinar today if myths were not perpetuated somehow by whomever. So again, I don't want to, disparage. I'm just saying that this is going to be a tool that you are going to need. This is going to be, I believe, a lifeline for school districts moving into the next 2-3 years. The unemployment in New York State, the unemployment applications over this time last year or over 2019 are up 1,000% on average, 1,000%. Every single community, rich, poor, middle class, everyone has been devastated with the unemployment and the economic fallout. And I know you're all grappling with that, and I don't mean to be doom and gloom. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. I'm trying to just say that this is the one area where you have some control, because EPCs do not require voter approval. Who could even, if your community wanted to, could support a bond? How are you going to interact with them right now? You know, how are you going to go out and do the roadshow you normally would to the PTAs and all of that? It's nearly impossible. But communities are hurting. They're going to need districts to toe the line, tighten their belts. I know you're already working on that, but this is a great way to not only get work done. For example, if you had a bond that you were planning that is out of the question right now, you can still move forward with a lot of it, probably, if you had energy items in there. Through this method, 0 tax increase, 0 voter approval. Just make sure that you have the right information about this concept. It can and does work absolutely beautifully. We've got 100 projects where people are ecstatic with the results and they're proud of the project, and there's no doubt in their minds whatsoever that they got the savings. It all comes down to the same thing I said in the beginning. When you do a bond, you get experts. When you do an EPC, it's not a bond. So you have to rethink your approach to get the result that everybody wants to see. So I want to thank everybody. I think we have a question. Okay, how do we get paid? Good question. So typically the way we get paid, and it doesn't have to be this way. As a company, we get paid out of guaranteed energy savings, just like all the costs. We work at risk, so we don't get paid unless or until you sign a contract with an ESCO. So we often work for 8 months, a year for free at risk. If you don't end up signing a contract with an ESCO, we don't get anything. Once you sign a contract with the ESCO is responsible for funding all of the fees in the project. So the ESCO that you select at that time would fund our fee. We would submit an invoice to you asking for our payment at that point. You would then approve it, so you're controlling our payments. We don't work for ESCOs. We're not working or negotiating with ESCOs. We work for you. But the ESCO would then provide the funding for our fee in increments throughout the project, starting with contract signing. Okay, so I hope that answered your question. Same as, you know, a regular project percentage of construction costs. Any other questions? Three o'clock on the dot.
Can you hear me now? If anyone has any other questions for Kendra and Dave, please let me know. Going once. Going twice. Okay, well, thank you so much, Kendra and Dave, for presenting with us today, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar. Thanks for your patience with our technical difficulties. If you have any feedback or you'd like to make a suggestion or you need anything from ASBO, please feel free to contact me personally. My email is Jocelyn, Jocelynn, that's 2 N's, at asbonewyork.org. And again, finally, the code word for this webinar is Ashley with an A. So thank you all very much and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.